Hi everyone, and welcome for joining us at this month's Power BI UK user group session. And I'm here with Daniel Marsh-Patrick, Microsoft MVP, and we're here to discuss building custom visuals in Vega. I'll give you a brief introduction on Daniel, and then I'll pass over to him for his session. Again, for participation, the Q&A is open, so if you do want to ask any questions throughout the session, please do. I will moderate those questions and pose them to Daniel towards the end of the session. For those of you that don't know Daniel, he's had a mammoth 17-year career, both across the UK and New Zealand, and he's been helping drive enterprise-wide solutions through process and software engineering, but predominantly from a business intelligence, data visualization and software integration background. As I'm sure those of you that know Daniel know, he's extremely passionate about the Microsoft BI stack, particularly obviously for Power BI, and he became Microsoft platform MVP. He's a contributor of free and open source custom visuals to the Power BI marketplace, and he's also, which I'm very envious of, Power BI community super user and regularly presents blogs and Power BI subjects. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Daniel with us, and without any further ado, I will pass you over to Daniel.
All right, thanks, Leon, and thanks everybody for attending. It's lovely to be here. It's a little bit dark outside New Zealand. I think it's about 5 a.m. at the minute. You sort of forget what it is time-wise when you present around the world. But yep, so I think Leon's done a pretty good intro. I think one of the things about me is I'm based in New Zealand, but I'm actually from the UK originally, so it's nice to be home, figuratively speaking. Can't quite get there in person, which I'd love to do. So I'm kind of hoping to get back to see family and friends soon and maybe meet a few of you in person. Yep, so here's a little bit about me, a few things you might sort of be able to use to get hold of me. I typically work for myself for a company called Cochubo, and I also work for Discovery AI as well. So Leon had Alice on a few weeks ago, who's really, really excellent with mapping and various other techniques in Power BI. So I get to work with her most days, which is really awesome. In terms of what I do, I've mostly been involved with Power BI for probably, I think, since it began actually, but I've got quite interested in its visual layer in the last few years because generally we tend to get stuck a little now and then, and I wanted to learn how to build custom visuals, so I started contributing to AppSource. So some stuff you may have seen that's by me is the violin plot visual, if you've seen that. I started looking at a small multiples visual. That was my first foray in, launched that about 3 and a bit years ago. I also do the HTML content visual, which is kind of handy for a lot of people. But I also play around a lot with bespoke visuals in Power BI, so I do a lot of private visual development, but I also use Charticulator a lot. But today, I'm going to talk about a little something else. So I've got a little bit of a lead in, but we'll get to things as we go. So in addition to knowing what makes a good visual, we need to sort of talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So I'm going to look at what options we have in Power BI when it comes to doing our own thing with visualization. We're going to look at some of the things we can consider around these approaches, how we can try and find a middle ground between UI-driven and full-blown code options, and what that might look like. So I think first and foremost, designing and building a perfect data model and crafting the ultimate clean sort of data transformations, they're a large piece of work in a BI project, which I'm sure you can appreciate. I've done quite a lot in my time. I'm still doing a lot. But while your end users don't always get to appreciate how much effort this can take, and we talk a lot about the iceberg, you know, the visualization is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's like 90 or 80% underneath that's modeling and transformation and design and architecture. That's not always visible to your end users, and the visualization experience you offer up to them, that ultimately represents the quality of this effort and should have a similar amount of care. And when we think about what's available in Power BI currently, we can think of this as a scale. So over on the left-hand side here, we talk about the clicky, draggy, droppy nature of Power BI, the very business-friendly nature of Power BI, where everything's really simple. We have what I regard a threshold as low code, where we probably don't want to wander too far over the line into technical work, but that's still quite a very left-leaning line. And then we have everything on the right here, which is where we're really getting technical and having to learn how to do everything ourselves. So firstly, we start with the core visuals. This is the easiest approach, the simplest things to use. They're built by Microsoft, they're supported by Microsoft, they're upgraded as part of the monthly release cycle. And this is where most people live, and some people can only live here for various reasons. If you can't do anything with core visuals, then you may want to start looking for a custom visual that someone else has already built. And this is a logical next step. If you've tried things like messing with DAX, try to use calculation groups, try to sort of bend them to your will, then you'll look at a custom visual possibly. And if you can choose those from AppSource, whether they're certified or uncertified, you're able to pick those, install them. Somebody else has done the work, and they have properties that you may be familiar with, but they have the same kind of interface and ease of use. On the right-hand side, this is probably where the most extreme thing is, and where most of my day job is spent, is you can actually learn how to do web development and start writing a custom visual yourself, and you can make that available privately, or you can publish it in AppSource, which is how I got started. But this is a huge barrier to entry for some folks in our line of work. I'm more of a full stack developer across the BI and software development spectrum. I've got a lot of experience in those areas, but not everybody is either interested or has the time to learn that on demand. So that's quite an expensive option in terms of time and effort. Just before the line here, we've got this great new thing called Charticulate. It's not new, but it's new inside Power BI. And I really love this tool. This is probably the nicest thing you can have in Power BI when it comes to building visuals without having to write any code. It requires a slightly different way to think. And anything to the right of this line it's going to have to be that mind process, that thought process that you employ. We've got something that's to the right, but not quite, and that's the R and Python visuals. So these are built into Power BI. And if you have expertise in R and Python, you can leverage existing frameworks and write a bit of code and get something working. But we have this big gap in the middle here. And these are still code-based approach, but let's have a quick look at this concept here, this R and Python visual. So I'm just going to very quickly fire up Power BI. Hopefully that's coming up. So this is just a simple R visual that I've built. So if we, it's just a simple bar chart. We've got country on the left. We've got sales as the measure, and we've got a y-axis and an x-axis, and we can kind of resolve this visually. I mean, this can be done in Power BI, but just to give you an idea, if you haven't seen R visuals before, we can click on the visual and we get a little editor down here. And what happens is we add our fields. We've got a measure and a column. We add that to the data set, and Power BI creates a binding to that. And we can access that as an object called dataset. So we can load a library, and this is called ggplot2, which is a very popular library in R. And we create a variable and we start to chain some functions together. So what we say here is we put country on the x-axis and we put country on the y-axis. Now this doesn't make sense because this is the other way around. But this is how the tool works. We start with plotting it this way, and then we flip it. So it turns it around here. So that's not overly intuitive, but it starts to show us that we can declare a chart from building blocks, which is kind of handy. But the thing with R and Python is we have a few limitations. So it's great for bespoke needs, but Power BI will delegate the script to either an R or Python runtime rather than handling it all under one roof. So when that visual loads, you have to have R or Python on your machine or through a gateway or available in the Power BI service for that code to actually execute. Power BI doesn't run it, just sends it off somewhere and that runs and comes back. So if you're using desktop that's local to your machine, and any users that contribute to that workbook need to have it on their machine as well for the visual to work. So if you deploy to the service, it will delegate it to an instance up there. But this could be subject to timeouts if you've got a long-running script. Could take, if it takes 5 minutes, then the service will just say, nope, sorry, that's too much resource. We're not going to allow that. There can also be a short delay or the appearance of a cold start. And that's while Power BI sends a script off. So it's a networky thing, sends a script off, waits for it to execute, returns it back, and that could result in some user experience issues possibly. And then also the last thing is that visuals in Power BI are interactive. You can click on the shapes and they do things. Visuals in R and Python, unless you're building a custom visual in R, which is getting to the far end of the scale, they are rendered as a static image. So there's no interactivity. You can't really do any further insight with them. So they're great for bespoke visuals, but perhaps not so great for end users. Positives we can take away is we just saw that with this ggplot visual that the ggplot code that we added is that there's this nature of declaring what you want to do. So instead of having to write raw R code, somebody has abstracted that a little bit more so that you just plug in the things that you want the library to do in terms of drawing a chart. You don't have to know the XY coordinates. You just have to tell it you want a particular type of chart, and that's pretty good. You still have to understand the nuances of the language to a degree, but using this library saves us from having to dive too deep, so it's quite nice. But this is why graphical tools are good for this kind of thing. If we can automate those steps further and minimize input or more things to learn, then that's going to win. And my own preference is to do that as well. I don't want to be spending ages diving into writing code. If I've got a user interface that does it for me and I can just click and move things around and choose from predefined properties, that's sensible. But when interfaces or frameworks have been built for things, that's when we can get constrained. We have many tools that simplify visualization, but they still treat They still treat the chart as a starting point, the type of chart. So with Power BI, we have a visualization palette, and we can choose the type of chart that we want. But these tend to be kind of individual charts, but all are formed from similar shapes. So that's fine. But if we want to wander outside of this, we want to apply reference line or overlay, then the visual has to support that feature. And if it doesn't support that feature, then that's when we start getting off the beaten path. And we want to start thinking about other ways of doing things. And we need to start thinking about workarounds or trying to think really creatively. So we may layer visuals, we may delve into R, we might learn how to write custom visuals, we might look at alternatives like Charticulator depending on our needs. And often that starts at the top and can vary depending on what you want to do. So we just looked at ggplot very, very briefly. I didn't want to spend a lot of time delving into writing code in R because that's not what today is about. It's just about showing you that there are ways of starting to think differently about visuals. Charticulator also has a similar concept as well, even though it's a user interface. They're very, very similar under the hood. ggplot's more expressive and it can deliver more customization at the cost of doing it with code. And there'll be limitations and they may take a bit longer to hit. Charticulator abstracts a lot of this into an interface. And because of that, you can get so far, but then there are still constraints that the authors have in place just in terms of what they allow you to do within those controls. But let's unpack that a little bit more. So instead of categorizing a chart and having to think about ways someone might want to build upon it, so instead of a bar chart or a column chart or a line chart or an area chart, which is also kind of a line chart, instead we could think about the ways someone could build upon it. So instead of that, we could define the components that we need to build potentially any chart from the ground up. And for anyone that's looked at data visualization outside of Power BI, or tools like Tableau, where you design and build charts in this way, you might have already come across the notion of a grammar of graphics or a mark-based visualization concept. So you can probably guess what the GG in ggplot stands for. It stands for grammar of graphics. So the grammar of graphics is a huge concept. It's a massive book. It's very, very interesting, but it's not the kind of thing we can just spend the whole lesson on. But this is probably the simplest abstraction of the concept. So this is a book by Leland Wilkinson in 1999 called The Grammar of Graphics. And what he does is he introduces us to a system of charting components and data flow processes. So we can see here that we start with the source and we move through a set of steps before we get our output. And every step assumes that there is a component in the solution to define the other things around it. It doesn't have to worry. It's very modular. And any tools or libraries, this includes the core visuals. They don't expose this to you, but they will use a similar process internally to develop a visual. So if you develop a custom visual, learning how to write code and going back to using tools that are common for that, you'll still hit these kind of steps. And if you don't, you can work around this, but this is generally known as a good practice for building visuals if you want to get into the lower level. So let's break this down a little bit. If I were to make a bar chart of sales by country, similar to the one we just saw in R, using a grammar type approach, instead of choosing a chart from a palette and adding my fields and customizing properties, I might be able to provide the following specification to a tool. There we go, PowerPoint, thank you. So my data set contains two fields. I've got country, which is what we call a nominal categorical value variable. It's not linear like a measure, it's discrete. So you get buckets on the chart for that. You want to show things by that. And then we have sales, which is a quantitative amount or a measure. So this is typically very easy to represent in a linear manner. Our brains are very good at processing that. What that we'll then think about is how we can visualize this. So when I have a canvas or a place on my report, I have X pixels width and Y pixels height. So when we drag a visual size or resize it, these X and Y spaces, this amount of space you've got reserved, will change. And this is something we don't really want to try and worry about, but we have to think about it. So I need my data fields to be encoded or scaled based on how much room I've got, based on the values that I have. So with country, because this is a nominal category, we want to spread it evenly across the height. So if we reduce the height, we want it to be evenly spaced, but bear this in mind. And with the sales amount, we want to use the amount of space we've got here across the visual, in this case of this chart, to make use of representing that measure accordingly. But what we want to do is, it's not easy for us as humans to take an XY raw value and turn it to a measure. We want to be able to use an axis to do that. So once we've got those spaces lined up, we want to be able to actually put values that we're familiar with on them and space them out based on that scale. So we can see here that everything is evenly spaced and makes sense to us. It's readable. And with sales, we can see that we've got a range of values from 0 to, this is $1 billion in this case. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to use what are called marks to represent the data. So in this case, we're going to use a bar, which is really a rectangle, to represent the measure. And we have 1 bar per country, and the width of the bar is equal to the sales amount. So our brains are very easily able to just work through this and process it. We can see this represents Canada, and Canada's sales are larger than France because the bar is longer. It's very easy for us to resolve width. Because the axis starts at 0, the distance from 0 tells us exactly, quickly, without needing to refer to the numbers, roughly who's the biggest. Now, we may ideally sort this chart in order so it's even easier for us to do that, but for now this is just getting the concept across. So this is when we talk about a grammar of graphics, this is the kind of process that visuals will do internally. And this is how you may need to start thinking if you want to get out of the pre-canned visuals. So the challenge is with implementing a grammar of graphics framework. Any tool that exposes this approach would turn it into a visual. And while this perhaps isn't quite as simple as choosing a pre-canned chart, you can start having more of a dialogue. So I can add more clauses to my specification, such as I want to encode its color based on the sales amount, which could translate to a legend. Or using the same scale and axes, I want to add a mark that represents the average of sales for all countries, which could be a line that sits over the bars. And perhaps a bar or a rectangle might not turn out to be the right choice, so I could swap this out for a line, for instance, and that may not be the best choice, but I'm able to experiment without having to choose a new visual or build that back up again from scratch. I can swap that in and out of place. But tools that implement a grammar of graphics really well, like ggplot, which we saw is a coding-based interface, they take a lot of research and engineering to get right, even for coding, but they're great for the right kind of developer. And tools that can do this within a user interface are very, very rare. So the two that come off the top of my head are Tableau and Charticulator. So Tableau is obviously its own thing, but it's got an incredibly rich graphical experience. Charticulator is Microsoft's, they've been incubating that research area for a little while, and that's now available as a Power BI visual, but it's the same concept. You have to start thinking in terms of components and marks, but they're very hard to implement, and they have some of the best people figuring this out. So, Tableau have an incredibly comprehensive R&D division. The Charticulator team was incubated by 7 to 8 researchers at Microsoft, and there's still a team of about 7 or 8 working on that. So there's a lot of people working on these things to make them simpler. But then you have me. I'm a single developer, but I like writing custom visuals, but I appreciate that it's not for everybody. And there's a lot of creative people out there that don't want to fully go down to here, but may wish to wander out of here and have a little bit more control over what they do. So I would like to put something in the middle and expose a grammar of graphics in Power BI that's less UI dependent and more expressive. but ideally less complex to master once the concepts are understood. So let's start the next chapter here. So there's a tool called Vega. I was introduced to this a couple of years ago, and this is a grammar language, and it's produced out of the University of Washington Interactive Data Lab. And these are the same folks that are responsible for tools like D3, which some of you may have heard of. What's nice about Vega is it uses JSON to create a specification. So as data professionals, some of us are familiar with JSON. It's a structure that's used to manage data in a way that's typically used within the web or to represent objects. It's quite nice to work with if you're a data professional and don't have access to a database. It's also quite easy to read, which is quite nice as a human. But the Vega interpreter will take this JSON that you build up and it will turn it into something that looks like a chart. So if we cast our minds back to that specification we formalized a while ago, this one here, we're going to have a look at how that might work in Vega. So if you can just bear with me. And unfortunately, my computer crashed just before I got onto this, and it's very early in the morning. So fortunately, it's left me where I'd like to be. So this is the Vega Editor. This is a tool online that allows us to see a specification. So what I've done here is I've pre-canned, and I have to kind of look off screen a lot to choose and copy paste, because otherwise you don't want to see me typing code out. It's incredibly monotonous. At the top here, we have something called a schema, which defines structures, because JSON's are very open-ended. So we're defining a structure, and this helps us to validate that. This is just something that Vega uses to validate that everything's okay. So if I, for instance, change that to data, this would error. But we're not going to worry too much about that. In JSON, we have arrays and objects. An array is represented by square brackets and indicates repeating elements. So in here, we can see I've got what's called a data set. I've given it a name of data set, and I've got some values, and I've got country Canada and sales, and I've got country France and its sales. So this is analogous to a row, and each one of these is analogous to a column. So I can see I've got my sales and I've got my country. So what I've done here is I've prescribed a data set that I want to work with. So the next thing I want to do is assign a height and width to that. So let's just, for time purposes, I'll just paste that in. And I've got this running, so this will update. So what we can see now is the canvas just jumped and it's reserved 500 pixels for the height and 750 pixels for the width. So we've already got a canvas, which is very, very exciting. I'm just going to jump ahead and paste this in. So the next thing we think about in our example was scales. So scales are bindings where we turn physical coordinates into coordinates that match our data. So we still don't see any changes here, but what I've done is I've set up two scales. I've got one called Y scale, and this is what's known as a band scale. So what that means is everything's evenly spaced. So this is just how the language works. And our domain, which is our values, is bound to that dataset object up here, and it uses the country field. So internally, Vega is working out that we need to space this out. It uses the height as its range, so that's its physical span. So what it's going to do is use that to convert the domain values, the values of the field, into physical coordinates. So this is something we don't have to manually work out ourselves. We then have what's called the X scale. I've defined that as our sales field, which is our measure, and that uses the width. So right now we can't see it, but that's going to go across in size accordingly. So let's do something that actually lets us see that, and we'll add axes. So the job of the next now is to convert a scale into something we can read. And here we go. So I've created two axes. I've got one that uses the Y scale that we defined, and it orients it on the left. So it puts it over here. I could just as easily then say, put that on the right. And Vega will work that out for us. We don't have to, the thing with building a custom visual from code is that you have to work all that out and then present that to the user. A tool like Vega does a lot of that for you. We'll put that back on the left. And similarly with the X scale, I could now see my values here. So I could orient that at the top instead, and it will put it at the top. So again, it's doing all the work for me. Now, if I change that width to say 450, that doesn't look very nice. And that's something we may have to clean up, but Vega will work it out for us. I could just easily change it to 800. And it's going to make the axis span. So any changes we make, it's going to deal with those calculations for us, which is really handy. And the last bit, which is probably the most hard to digest currently, if you're not having a fun time already, is we add a mark, which is the final step. We want to show the bars. So what we do now is we specify we want to add a rectangle. It's bound to the data set. And we have what's called an encoding. Now, an encoding is used to bind values or attributes of your data to physical things on the visual. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but there's an event called enter, which means when the element is drawn. What does that do? There's also update and there's exit. And if you've used D3, you might be familiar with the concept of what's called a data join. So this is how you prescribe things that happen. So, you know, if I add new fields, we won't do this here because our data set is fixed, but in Power BI, we're often moving fields around and changing data sets. We might have to prescribe this a bit more differently. So a lot of people just use update. Whoops. By a paste code, because typing and talking is really hard. We don't see any physical change here, but if our data set were to change, this would deal with all that for us. It would deal with the removal or the adding of things. We don't have to worry. But what's important is we've got attributes of the rectangle. So the X position is bound to the 0 value on the scale. And then Vega says, oh, that's probably about 50 pixels across. I'll deal with that for you. You don't have to worry. You just know that it's the 0 value. So that's pretty handy. But developing a custom visual, you have to think about this stuff. X2, which is the end of the rectangle, which is probably the more exciting part for the chart, is bound to that sales measure, but it uses the same scale. So it's pretty good. It just works it all out. Now, similarly, I could just change this value here to say 100. Well, it wouldn't be very good. Maybe a million. There we go. We can see now that it almost works like a ranged chart. Just keep adding numbers to it until it moves. It's the problem with billions, but we can see that we can actually start changing things. So you could use this as an approach to say build a ranged bar chart or something like that. Moving on though, because this is not the focus. The Y encoding, this encoding here is bound to country. So again, Vega works it out. And the height of the bar is bound to the scale that we created. So this scale we've defined up here, we've said it goes across the height of the chart and it has a padding of 10%. So, you know, if I wanted to change that padding to say 20%, we don't have to tell the bar to do anything different. We just, Vega works it out and increases the padding. So this is the kind of how you might parameterize things. So when changing properties in Power BI, the tool under the hood is passing this kind of stuff into its own internal framework, whatever that looks like. Now, Vega is a really big concept. It's huge. We could spend hours talking about it. You know, visual development, the problem with it is it's not something you can condense into an hour. So I'm giving you a very big concept in a very short space of time, and for that, I do apologize. And that may seem like still a bit too much for you. Even as a developer, that's quite a big concept to take on board. But fortunately, we have something called Vega Lite, which is a similar concept. It still uses JSON. But it's lower level. It has simpler directives that you can use, and these will get passed to the lower level interpreter and render. So what we'll do is we'll repeat that exercise, but we'll do it with Vega Lite instead. So if you can bear with me, I just need to set something up because of the aforementioned computer crash. I had this already, but unfortunately it only remembers the last thing you did. So I'm just going to swap this over to Vega Lite and paste that in. So this looks very similar to before. We have our schema, which is Vega Lite this time, so it's got a different set of validation, and we've got a data set. Now the difference is that Vega Lite only works with a single data set, but this is great because Power BI only works with a single data set as well. So the difference now, I'm going to put that height and width in just like before. So nothing's really different from Vega, so this is not that exciting for you. And I do apologize, but it's just going to become very obvious in a moment how much simpler it is. So with Vega, we had to build a structure for that rectangle, tell it exactly what had to be done. This time, Vega Lite has some pre-canned shapes that are common for us as visualization developers. So a bar is really a rectangle, but it gives you a lot of shorthand for how to build it. And the only thing I'm going to do now is I'm just going to paste these in and talk about them, is add an encoding channel and Y and X. And I'm going to bind Y to the country, just like before. And an X is going to be bound to the sales. So if we think about everything here was the same as Vega. This is a little bit different, but I've got something that's really, really simple, and if I wanted to explore what a chart might look like, I could change it to a line, and Vega Lite would work it out for me, and that's a really simple change. Let's change it back to bar for now. But this is a simpler concept. This is what's called a single layer plot. So we've got a mark, we've set it to bar, and we're encoding the values of that mark to the country and sales from the data set. So this is already a lot simpler, which is quite nice. So in terms of my goals, my next logical step is I want to see if I can make that work inside Power BI. Now it's low level, but it is still possible to do something with. So, I had a look around and I thought someone must have already tried this, right? And no, they really hadn't. I found a custom visual that someone had worked on, and actually at Microsoft by Dominic, actually, who was one of the developers for Vega. He wasn't working for Microsoft, but he worked with Microsoft to help them do it. But that was still a custom visual that you had to take the code, build it locally. And if you wanted to change the specification that we just saw, you had to do that in the code, recompile the visual, and make a Power BI visual file. So what I was thinking about was something more like the Vega Editor that we just saw, which is a huge project for somebody to do, as I learned. So we're now going to talk about what I'm actually going to present today. I just wanted to do a little bit of a lead in so that we can understand. So I'm going to present Denip, which is a visual that I'm working on, which is still in its infancy. But this will give you access to Vega or Vega Lite within a Power BI visual, and you can add it to your workbook. So the reason I chose Denip, which is a bit of an odd name, but we'll go with it. We have, Vega is the brightest star in the northern constellation of Lyra. And the team used this theme in a number of projects within their ecosystem. They have a tool called Lyra, for instance, which is the main constellation, which is a slightly higher level interface-based version. But there's also Altair, which is a binding for Vega and Vega Lite for Python. And Altair is the brightest star in the constellation of Aquila. And I don't know if you know about Power BI, but it's a very familiar logo there. They had that for a couple of years, so I won't dwell on that for too much longer. But it's been around for a little while now, and Denip has been going free, which I found out when I started doing some work, and I thought, ooh, I'm going to take that, or at least I'm going to use it as a working title for my visual while I think of a better name. And I did a couple of social posts on the idea, and it seemed to have stuck with the Vega folks, and they quite like it, and they've been very accepting of it. So for the moment, certainly it's going to stay. But this is the tool I'm going to present. But let's actually do a demo in Power BI rather than a browser. So Denip currently is in what I would regard as public preview. So I have a website for it, which I'll show shortly. Currently, it's not an app source, and the reason it's not an app source is because for me to develop and iterate quickly, tying it to app source is quite difficult, because once a visual is an app source, it's quite hard to get updates through. They have to go through a full review process, even if it's an uncertified visual. So for the moment, I'm releasing short updates, very quick updates, and it's easy for me to manage that through my website. So for now, it's a downloadable visual. And you can, it's in the slide deck shortly, I'll give you the link. But we have this visual over here, which is Denip, and we add that to the canvas, and we get this guy here. So this gives us a little bit of an instruction, but the goal of it is to be very similar to the R and Python visuals. So let's do some stuff. So I'm going to grab my sales measure. And now I've got a measure, it's starting to change. The screen actually now gives us some instructions. This will be slightly nicer for the end user as I go through development, but for now it's just to get people moving forward. We'll add in our country field, but I'm going to use the short version of that because the test data set that comes with Power BI has very long United States relative to the rest of the countries. Now, once I've got data in here, I can edit the visual. So in the ellipsis here, the visual header, some visuals expose what's known as an advanced editor. So if you've used Charticulator or Power KPI Matrix or the Infographic Designer, they all have this functionality. So we can leverage that as well. And this isn't visible for your end users when they're viewing the reports in service. But when you're developing your reports, it's something that comes up. So because we haven't done any work, this is a new specification screen. So we've got the choice of choosing some simple samples because we want to try and, whilst Vega is very well documented, and that's the nice thing about it, actually, I should have pointed this out, is it's not proprietary to Microsoft. It's a very commonly used language outside of Power BI for visualizing on the web. So there's a lot of support elsewhere that you may not get on the Power BI community, but you can go to Google Groups, you can go to Stack Overflow. There's lots and lots of examples, and there's a lot out there if you want to learn. So my focus is more on bringing the tooling into Power BI than reinventing the wheel and teaching you everything, but I just want to show you where to start. So we've got a couple of examples. So I can click on, say, simple bar chart, and it will let me map my fields. But I'll start with an empty spec just for now, but I can specify whether I want Vega or Vega Lite or Vega, and the template option is new, which has certainly not been there since when I presented this before, but we'll have a look at that shortly. So if I click create, I then get a specification editor. And one of the things we saw, if we go back to the editor briefly, is we had to specify our data, our height and our width, and our schema. Well, all this stuff is built into the visual. So the difference between this visual and say our visual is the runtimes are all packaged up. So you install the visual, Vega and Vega Lite are packaged as part of that visual, and if you publish that to the service or give it to someone else to develop, it's all encompassing. So it's totally portable, which is really good. But what I've got here is I have to define my data, but I've given it a name of dataset, and this says go back to the visual. So these are being passed in to here, so we don't have to manually declare that. So we're already saving a bit of time. So what we did before was we said, that's a bar. And at the moment, this is manually running. So I can either control and enter to run or click apply. There's also an auto apply, which could be expensive if you're building massive visuals. So we don't turn it on by default, but I'll turn this on because it's easier. So we've now got a bar that spans the whole height of the visual because we don't have an encoding channel. So I'll type that in actually, so it doesn't take too long. We add an encoding channel, and we'll add our Y channel. And what's nice about this is it will auto pick yields from the dataset. So it tells us it's a column. We can click on country, and now it will encode the country along the height of the visual. With X, we will do, do sales. Now, what's weird about this is it's not doing what you expect. The reason is Vega Lite tries to guess what you mean, and its default guess is to make it a category. So treat it as categorical. So what it's actually doing is it's creating a category for each number and positioning it based on that. So what we have to do with linear type things is we actually have to assign it as quantitative, which is much easier to do when you're not talking at the same time. So now we can see it's actually doing what we expected. So we've got a bar chart that looks very much like the one we just did in the editor with a lot less code because the tool has dealt with the height, the width, the data set for us. So if I go back to the report, or I can show you here, is I can actually collapse the editor and it will expand to fill. So what's quite nice is if I go back to the report, I've now got a bar chart that I can size accordingly. So with these single layer plots, Vega's really good at just working this out. So this is quite nice for the Power BI experience. Let's go back in there. What I'm going to do is jump into settings, and we've got options here. We can change out the provider as we go. I would suggest working with Vega Lite as much as possible. I very rarely use Vega, but I've given it as an option for people that might want to use it. Everything I've had to do so far, I've been able to do in Vega Lite. But there's also this render mode here. So this is defaulting to canvas. And what we actually would prefer in this case is to use SVG. So if you're familiar with SVG, it's a graphic system which is good at any resolution. So canvas is a faster renderer, but it comes out like an image, much like the R visuals, but it still has some of the stuff that Vega can offer, which the R visuals don't. But SVG is a lot crisper and cleaner. So that visual looked a bit blurry. Now it's a lot cleaner. So what I'm probably going to do is make SVG a default because it's a lot more nice for accessibility as well. So back in our specification, this is not as exciting because, we can do this in Power BI. So one of the things we talked about was in Power BI, it would be really nice if, we've got this core bar chart here, which is very similar, but, obviously this is all finished and looks part of Power BI. But if I wanted to put an average line on this, I don't really have any options. I'd have to maybe, if I go to the analytics pane, all I can really do is add a constant line here. I can't, I could put I could put like, I could put 500 million. Zeros. Oh, that's a bit shifty. That shouldn't do that. Anyway, that's one of the issues we've got to deal with. But you can see that we can manually place it, but it's not measure bound. So one of the things we can start getting clever with is in the visual that we've just built, we could actually then start to think, well, we could layer our plot. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated. But we then start thinking about marks. So what I have now is one rectangle, but what I would like to do is maybe have a label to show the value, so I can take away the axis, but also put a line over. Now, Vega Lite has really good capabilities for making transformations. So you want to do as much as you can in the model, but you can actually do transformations in here that aren't possible with core visuals. So what I'm going to do very quickly, because I don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to kind of blow your mind with a pre-canned one, and we'll just unpack it a little bit. And we'll run that. And what we'll do as well is we'll just do a quick repair and format, so we can actually, even if our code's a little untidy as we go, we can actually repair it. So what we've done now is we've added a layer, and we're kind of going quite a bit further here. So let's just collapse this one. So a layer is an array of objects. But what I've done here is it lets us put a description in so I can start to help explain this a bit more. So you as a developer, you as a person trying to build a new visual, you have to, this might be built up incrementally, and I'd love to spend the time doing that, but we're only fairly limited. So the encoding is the same. We've got country and we've got sales. The only difference is I've improved the padding a little bit. So we saw that before. I can change the padding. Let's just turn on the auto apply. So I can make that a little bit more. I can improve the spacing. That's a 40% pad. So that's the only difference from before. The only difference is I've put it inside a layer now. So what I want to think about is the encoding channel for this layer uses the same X and Y. So I've got my bar. The difference now is I've added in a text mark, which is a label. So the only difference that uses the same X and Y, so it actually puts it at the end without us having to work out how to position it. I've said align it to the left. I could just as easily say align it to the right, and it would put it inside the bar. And I've got this attribute here called dx, which is a slight change. It's like a nudge. So once you've placed it, nudge it this many pixels. So what you're able to do here is we're kind of blowing things wide open, but we're kind of showing you just exactly how much you can customize things. So with the visual and its properties, you only have exposed what people have actually made available to you. But with a tool like this, you can actually go in and fine tune absolutely everything. So this does not look exciting. We will get to that in a moment. The reason this is looking like this is because the raw value comes into the visual, and we want to make that raw value workable. So if it came through formatted, it would be a text value and it wouldn't be something we could work with. So this is currently the raw value, but we actually have tools to help with this, which we'll show in a short while. But for the minute, just suspend your disbelief. So our layer object has two entries, and now we'll expose the other one. And what I've done in here is I've added a rule, which is a line, and in its encoding, I've just specified aggregate it using the mean sales, and this uses a quantitative scale as well. So this calculates the mean and returns a single row. I could just as easily say max, and it will move it over to the top. So this is a way of being able to produce measure-bound overlays that you can actually combine different types of visuals. So this immediately starts to become a bit scary. Believe me, I've been there. But you can start to actually fine-tune everything you want to fine-tune. So if we just make sure, yeah, that's still SVG. If we jump out of this, I've now got my line. It resizes accordingly. And, if I added a slicer, wake up computer, oh yeah, we don't want to worry about our visuals. That's one of the nice things about our visuals as well. I forgot to mention is you're always getting prompted to, are you sure you want to use these? So if we had, say, the date, we could adjust that, and our line will update accordingly, based on the actual average that's being derived from the data that's being passed in. So the next step we'll do, and again, I would love to spend a whole heap of time doing this, but what we'll do is we'll just demonstrate the template functionality as well. So if I like this design, if I get to a point with it, I can actually generate a template, and this gives me a dialog that I can type some details in. So I can give it a name, I can give it a description and give it an author name. This is a new feature that we've just released. What it does is it looks at the columns and the measures, and it allows you to type in alternative names. So for instance, with country, I could say category. And with sales, I could say measure. And that's what would be displayed to my end users. And I can also add some optional tooltip information. So if I were to do that, then click Generate Template. This is the specification and all the metadata that's needed to give it to someone else to import into their version of Ditto. Unfortunately, visuals, and this is the same problem with Charticulator, with templates, you can't actually directly save files out of them for security reasons. So we have to copy it to the clipboard and save it. But here's one I prepared earlier style. I've got this option to import from template. I'll choose my template and I will load in my finished visual, which is a significantly more advanced version. It actually uses most of what you've seen. And you can see now with the templating, it's very similar to when we create a new visual. It's I've called it category, and I've got a little tooltip here, which I put some more information in. But those, if we fill those fields out, then it presents it, and we can see that that should be a categorical value. And because it's a column, we can only choose the column that's in the data set. Now, if I wanted to add in, say, product becomes available for me to choose as well. So it's quite responsive. So we choose country. And we'll choose sales as the measure, and we'll click create. So this is just bringing us up to speed. So the difference now is I've done some styling, so it looks a little bit more at home in Power BI. So we'll just jump out very quickly. And I've got a nice formatted label, and I've got my average, and I've got a value on here so that my user can see it pretty quickly. What I'll do is just explain. A lot of the styling is dealt with via what's called config, and this is a way of theming your chart. So we try where possible to abstract this away from the specification so that this is more about what we're actually doing in terms of moving things around. With configuration, we can configure very, we can get down to all kinds of stuff. So we can change the font size of the labels versus the axes. We can specify whether to include little dashes on the ticks or not. We can turn the title on or off, which is stuff we can do in Power BI. But we can do things like change the spacing of the label from the axis and all kinds of things. It's incredibly rich. So the documentation has all this built in. It's quite handy. But I specified the color of the bar. For the ruler, I've said make it 50% opaque and make it orange and make it too wide. So I could just easily say make it 20 wide. And I'd get this big, lovely line. And I can specify exactly how bold I want the text. So font weight is actually, we could say I actually want to be 800, which is like super, super bold. And it would do that. So we're already starting to get things that are outside the confines of the drop downs that we've seen in the visuals. Now, in terms of what we've done here, this is basically the same code. The only thing I've done that's different is I've done a couple things actually, is with the text field that we added, text mark that we added, that was not nicely formatted. We can actually specify a format string for that. Now, because Vega is built on tools like D3 and D3 is a very wide tool for the web, they have and Charticulator has the same thing. They have their own type of formatting string, which is not Power BI formatting. So we've recently just built in the ability you can specify a custom format type, and we've included the Power BI formatting. So you can either choose the default formatting or the Power BI formatting. So I prefer to do this, but what I've done here is just to make it millions, and that works. It's got one decimal place. I could just easily make that two decimal places if I wanted to, and that will do all the work there. The only thing I've done additional is in the other layer where we did the aggregate line, I've added a text label. And this is, I'll make the workbook available, and I'll talk with Leon after this so that we can find a way of sharing it for you so that you can just explore yourself. I've added in a custom text expression. So I just wanted to illustrate just how complicated you can be. You can actually concatenate things and display some very rich information. So it's not, clicky, draggy, droppy, but you can actually, if you want to try something, you can actually start to expand the palette of what's available quite readily. The other thing we haven't done yet is talked about, the difference between our visuals and core visuals or custom visuals is they're not interactive. Because Vega and Vega Lite are built for the web, they are compatible with Power BI in terms of the same technology. So Power BI doesn't need to delegate them off anywhere. It can, they're treated as the same class citizens. So what that means is that we actually could start integrating with Power BI. So the only API we've built at the minute is the tooltip handler. We're intending to add more, but right now this is baby steps. Because this is so flexible, we have to test everything. So tooltips we're quite comfortable with, although even those need some more work. So with tooltips, we need to define which object should actually have tooltips on, because we don't want tooltips on everything. We don't want tooltips on this line here. We don't want tooltips on anything we add that's not useful to the user. So with our bar, we just add a tooltip true flag, and all of a sudden, I can start to get tooltips. So what it's able to do is resolve back to the data model, and because it's not going off somewhere else and coming back as a static image, we're able to actually say to Power BI, okay, cool. This is the row context you gave us. If you have a report page tooltip, can you display it for us? Which is quite handy. So I can, I have a tooltip already in my workbook, and it's all good. This is I can say use a default tooltip, and the behavior of the visual is if it can't find a report page, then it will always try and display a default. So what this means is interaction is tricky because visuals can't reach into the data model. They're not allowed to look in and say, oh, I need this and I need that. What happens is Power BI pushes the data to the visual. So in this case, it's pushed sales and country, and it's given me a table that I can work with. And this is all I know about. So with interactivity, if I want to display a tooltip, or I want to make a, let's just say we get into cross highlighting or anything like that, or clicking and filtering, or context menus and drill down, I have to be able to tell Power BI exactly the context it gave me, otherwise the user gets an incomplete experience. The other challenge is if we do complex transformations that move the data away from what Power BI gave us, then it becomes sometimes impossible to reconcile, because you can do things that Power BI doesn't know about. You can build incredibly rich visuals. You can do things like build histograms and density plots just using logic in here. That means you don't have to do complicated modeling in your data model. But it also means that the ability to reconcile those against the data model is also lost. So where that happens, we try and always display a default tooltip. But what we're doing is finding all the cases where we can make it work as a report page tooltip. So that works quite nicely. So the idea is we're improving this as we go. So this is version 0.3, 0.4 I'm working on at the minute. We've got even more cases where it will pick up the tooltip correctly. We're going to add in the context menu so you can do drill through, and we're going to add in selection. Now, to manage your expectations, those will require you as a designer and developer to wire that up. But it creates an API with Power BI that the R and Python visuals don't have. So I'm definitely getting short on time, so I didn't get a chance to demo a lot of what I wanted to demo. But what I'm planning to do is I'll make this workbook available. One thing I just did want to show you is how to do something incredibly complicated. Is how we could do something a little bit different to a bar with, the average line can't be done. But what if I wanted to build a matrix that's a little bit richer? So this is an example I did recently with Charticulator that I've also done with Dineb. A lot of people like tables and values because they tell us a lot about the information we're looking at. So, we've got our country and our month of the year, and we can see how much the sales were for each month. and what the total sales were, and at each part of the matrix, which is fine, but that's quite a lot of work to wade through. If you want to know which month had the highest sales and which country it was, I've just been talking for 5 seconds and you probably couldn't tell me. However, if I change it slightly, and this is still within the the core visuals, I can add some conditional formatting to do that, and while you're talking, you'll probably be able to figure out that it's this one because of the darker color. We can optimize that a bit more so that it's even easier to read. So we can actually do some stuff with measures to, turn this down to whole numbers. We can, soften the conditional formatting. We can do some hacks with DAX to make this go away. And this is all documented here. We can put some little white lines between the boxes so that it's easy for us to quickly perceive, and we can get a little bit more out of that. So we've gone from here to here. But now the next step would be, if I needed to know this for totals, I've got a similar challenge. So one of the things I've just built ahead of this, which I was hoping to unpack a bit more, but unfortunately, time is always a fun thing like that, is this concept of marginal bars. So this is something that was demoed in a book called The Big Picture by Steve Wexler, which has just been released. It's fantastic. But this idea is about adding, having a matrix with additional plots, which can help us to contextually work this stuff out quickly. So we can easily see that the highest sales were in the USA and the highest month was December overall. Now, here's a good example where we're able to get a report page tooltip. But because the transformation breaks it slightly, we just get a standard tooltip. But this is hopefully going to be improved going forward, but there's a good example. But we built this out of 4 specifications, but it's a single visual. So it's one query against the model. And just to give you some nightmares, this is what it looks like. So this looks a little bit scary. But what I've done is I've gradually gone through and iteratively worked this out. So this is using what's called a vconcat, which concatenates 2 plots vertically or more. You can actually specify as many as you like. And in each entry of the vconcat, there's 2 of them. So vertical 1, let me just see if I've got zoom it running. Fortunately, I do. Everything was geared up to go. So the first vertical concat is these 2. And the second one is these 2. So when I say 2, this is actually a plot on its own because it's the sum of everything. And then the horizontal concats are this and this. So this took me a couple hours to do, but I'm able to export that as a template. And if I wanted to say, do that for something else, wrong page, there we go. If I wanted to do that for some, oh, these are visuals, man. If I wanted to do something else, then I could, let's just do sales again. But if I wanted to do, say, product by, let's just pick one out of the air here. We'll do country again. And we'll just drag that out a bit. And we'll edit that. So if you were to create this, or I were to create this and make this available, I could import my template, add my marginal bar matrix, and I've wired this up so that it's a little generic. So I can choose to put, say, country on my rows. And here I've got month, which this suggests that it should use a date time field because that's how the author, used it. But I could, if I'm feeling saucy, I could actually not, I could throw a caution to that. Product is clearly not a date column. We only just mandate columns versus measures because what the idea is that you can take this template and refine it yourself. So if this doesn't quite work, you could tune it. So let's add sales and click create. And now we've got a marginal bar matrix, which works for 2 different categories, and one is in the date. But we can see that quite clearly here, Paseo is the, let's just turn that tooltip off for a sec while I am talking. We can see that Paseo has the most sales overall, but we can still see the USA had the highest sales. So I've taken something, someone else developed, in this case it's me, but I'm able to share that and make it available and save someone else some time. So it's still early days, but quite excited about it and really interested into, if you're interested in taking this up, then let's go back to the PowerPoint because we've just done a whole bunch of stuff. So we've talked about the interactivity challenges, but this is a summary for those that want to spend a little time reading about it. In terms of where we are next, so I want to build out those APIs to provide more interactivity features for the end user. So the idea is you should be able to take stuff in Vega that people have done and be able to implement it and integrate it with Power BI as much as possible. So there's some really great use cases for that. I'm working towards a version 1 at the minute, so I'm building this in my free time, but making it available as new releases become available, improving its accessibility, improving its performance and stability, and getting it into app source. And what I'd like to do, and this is something we don't know if we can do, but we're going to try, is to get it certified, because certification is very trustworthy. But this is a very special case, so I need to have those conversations. So in terms of finding out more, there's the website that I've been building, so denebviz.github.io, and also the Vega and Vega Lite documentation. So what's nice about these tools, Vega has examples and tutorials and documentation, so we can look at the examples. And each one of these you can click on, get the specification, and start to figure out how to wire it back up to Power BI. So I guess the key thing is, if we look at, say, this regression line, we can find out what the data set looks like. We can find out what people are doing. This is, a little bit of stuff going on here, but we also have the documentation. So the team are really good at documenting the tools. It explains how everything works, and it's the same with Vega Lite. So again, we have examples. Lots of things to play with. What's nice about Vega Lite is it's very easy to play once you've got the hang of it, and you can do some incredibly cool stuff. So it's very easy to do things like, box plots are much easier than drawing them by hand. You can actually do trellis plots. You can do two-dimensional trellis plots as well. So like small multiples, they typically just work on a single dimension, so country, but you can have country by product as small multiples, which is something that the core visuals don't do. So a good example of that is something like a scatter plot matrix. They're quite easy to do in Vega Lite with the right data. Again, they have documentation. So everything is there to refer to, and it's quite rich. And as I say, there are communities that are out there that can help with that. And then finally, we have the website here, which just helps to explain how it works for Power BI. So this references documentation as well, but it explains how to get Deneb, does a simple worked example, and steps it through. So it explains how to add the visual, how to add the data, how the dataset binding actually works. So if you want to understand some of the limitations that we have as a visual developer in Power BI, that will help to understand how the editor works, things you can do with the editor, finding your way around, how to do tooltips, how the strategy works, talks a lot about the challenges we have with interactivity and how it could be different from R and Python, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I could talk about this all day. I'm already looking at my clock and it's 5 minutes past the hour. So what I will do is I will open the floor back up to Leon, because he's let me monologue for such a long time now. And if any of you are still around, maybe you have some questions.
No problem at all, Daniel. First thing I can say is thank you, because there goes my evening. I know what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my night now, and it's going to very much involve Deneb, Vega and Vega Lite. And obviously, in terms of the links that you shared, I've put those and made those readily available in the chat, the Q&A functionality for everybody to take a look at. So first and foremost, thank you for an absolutely amazing session.
Thank you.
I think everybody, we do have some questions, but I think everybody's the same as me. That's their jaws have dropped, and we bow and salute you for your fantastic work. So I'll just go into the questions. So we have one from Solar, and they ask, when we want to create a custom visual, do we always think that it should be a simple visual, or start with a simple visual in mind, like a bar or a column chart?
Yes. So if you're talking about going back to basics and going into Power BI and building a custom visual from scratch, always try and start with the simplest possible visual, just because the challenge you have with building custom visuals is you can take, much like we just showed with Vega, you can take examples and put them into this, and it should be a bit easier than it is with building a custom visual. But what you find is that the Power BI visual layer has its own things you've got to get used to. So there's the concept of the life cycle of a visual. So visuals are created and updated, and you have to learn about this is one of the big differences between taking a chart that someone's built in, say, D3, that's designed to work with static data, and a chart that in Power BI needs to work with dynamic data and has to deal with changing slices and column values and context and all kinds of stuff. So what I would always recommend is start with a simple chart like a bar chart, lift it into the visuals framework, understand the life cycle changes that happen with custom visuals so that you can see your visual data update. Because one of the biggest mistakes that, I can share these for sure, you make as a developer when you start is you get a visual working, but then when you resize it or you slice it, stuff sticks around. There's artifacts that are left because you haven't thought about how to clean them up. And it's all about getting that right before you go full tilt. And then again, it's like learning how to do things like highlighting, tooltips. The team expose a lot of APIs for you to use, but each one has its own learning curve. But it certainly makes you appreciate just how hard it is for the team at Microsoft to build visuals that work for so many people. So we, as visualization creators, get frustrated sometimes with visuals and their limits. But Microsoft had to build something that satisfies so many use cases and are business user friendly. So the difference between custom visuals and core visuals is a huge gulf. You get so much control with a custom visual at the cost of having to learn it all. So I've been doing it for 3.5 years. I wish I started doing it sooner because I still think there's so much to learn, and I spend probably half my week building custom visuals. So I appreciate that it's hard, but yes, definitely start with something simple.
Fantastic answer. Our next question is, how does this Vega created visual work with different data sets? So if we had if we had a data set which was structured very differently, how time consuming is it to adapt a Vega visual to the data?
This in itself can be this can be a subject all of its own. What I generally advise is and this is the same advice you could use for a tool like Articulator. The use cases for these visuals are really for bespoke cases. You may be able to share them with other people to build their own designs, but you wouldn't fill a workbook with these visuals. I mean, you could, but you want to enrich your data with, if there's a particular type of visual that Power BI can't do, this is common at Discovery AI because we're in the environmental industry. There's so many visuals that are standard to the environmental industry, but they're not thought about from a business perspective. So a lot of visuals we build they seem quite niche to the outsider, but they're common across the industry. And this is probably where these visuals are really handy. But with the data set, you have to think about it as a table. So what I do with tools like Articulator, because I use that a lot in my work, and I use Deneb as well, and I use core visuals, I use whatever gets the job done. And that's what I'd advise. This isn't a replacement for visuals. It's a tool that you need to use judiciously. Think about the data set as anything you can get in what looks like a table visual. Think about your grain, your level of detail, and how that needs to work. So once that data goes into the visual, how do you need to possibly do more transformations on it to aggregate it how you want? And this is exactly the same with Articulator, because Power BI only gives us a single data set. We need all the data before we can work on it. Like I said before, we can't reach in and grab the fields we want. We don't even know what the data set looks like. All we know is that Power BI pushes the results of a query to our visual, and that's the data we have to work with. So for anything you want to build, you need to think about the row context. You need to think about the data you need to make it work. And obviously, everyone's model is different. And like I said, you'll appreciate just how hard a challenge it is to build visuals like the core visuals that work so well for so many people. This is an unfortunate slap to the face when you start doing this stuff, unfortunately. So believe me, visual like the violin plot took me 5 hours to get a prototype working on static data. Took me another 195 hours to get it responsive, to make it work for so many use cases. It's that, it's the 80-20 rule. To make a visual work for you versus for someone else there's again a massive gulf between that. That's honestly the reality of it. It's difficult. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but we're trying to make it easier through tools like this.
Oh, definitely are as well. And some of our users have had a chance to go and look at the Vega Lite templates. So do you have any best practice to implement the coding to match our own demand as such?
Generally, what I would do, so what's nice about, I'll just share the screen again, because there was a bug that prevented us from doing this. The challenge is often with the Vega Lite and the Vega templates is when the data set is a remote data set. So they have a lot of data sets that are, served remotely. So one of the things we need to do as part of certification is not load stuff from elsewhere. So that includes images. So currently Deneb doesn't it won't load remote resources because we're trying to get ready for attempted certification. But if I were to find an example, so if we were to get, say, a bar chart here from the examples gallery, if the data is declared, I can basically just copy paste that. So whilst my, so let's just add Deneb on, I still need to, I'm working on making it so you don't need something in the data set, but for now you need to add some data. They've only just made it available to custom visuals that we can do that. So in the last month, so I'm working on that at the moment.
Okay.
But what I can do is I can just close this down and paste in a template. That's not going to work because I should have copy pasted as is. But I can put that in, and that data is static. But I can then use that to help me work out what I need to do with data from the model. So I could just as easily swap that out with fields. But that's how I would start to get it to work. It's honestly my call to action to you, I hate to say, is I am not in a position. I'm doing this in my free time. I'd love to do it for a living, but open source doesn't really pay. It's done out of passion, at least certainly with the Power BI. You know, I'm not exactly keen on paying for visuals either. So at the minute, I'm putting all my effort and time into building the technology, and any software developer knows we don't exactly like doing documentation because it means we're not coding. But I'm conscious that I need a website to give you an intro as a user. So a call to action would be, I'm kind of going to need your help if this thing's going to work. So I'm learning from you as well. And the thing is, I don't know everything about the framework either. I know lots about it. I've built some incredibly cool stuff with it, but I'm learning all the time. So, you know, there's a good example. I'm just going to play for time because I did have this all lined up, but as luck would have it, I'm not going to be able to show you because it's taking too long. But there's a great creator down in this neck of the woods called Kerry Kolosko. She produced an example for Makeover Monday using Deneb the other day, which was a heat map. Yeah,
I saw that.
Yeah, that's a really awesome thing, and I didn't even think about trying that, and it's given me ideas. So what I'm trying to do is focus on bringing the tooling to you so that you can surprise me. What I don't want to do, you know, custom visuals is we don't want to really gatekeep it for people, but the reality is it's hard because it's a new skill set and it requires a lot of trapping cases and figuring it out. So a tool like this, I'm really making it available, and that doesn't leave me a lot of time outside of fixing bugs and making the tooling work to promote. You know, I'd love to do sessions like this all the time, but much like how people get excited about DAX hacks or ways of making visuals do things they're not supposed to and writing about them and promoting them, I'm hoping this may move you enough to think about how you can help others as well. So what we don't have at the minute is a template hub so Deneb templates are a little bit different. They include the Vega spec, and all the metadata gets packaged up in a special object that, you know, you could copy paste the Deneb template into Vega, but it wouldn't necessarily work because the dataset's not bound. But that's all documented on the website. But honestly, it's more about I need a little bit of community help as well.
And that's what we're here for, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. But no, I mean, if you're doing cool stuff, I'd love to hear from you. In short, but yes, don't have all the answers, sadly.
No problem at all. What I'll do, so you briefly answered one of our questions there in terms of will Deneb ship with templates, so choosable templates as part of the UI?
So the idea was originally yes, and what we've got here is, so again, I'll just jump back. When we create a new spec, I've put some in. So for instance, I've got a simple bar chart, so we could just do what we did. We could choose, you know, and if we don't have enough stuff here, we drag in the product, and all of a sudden we've got a product to choose from, and we can choose a measure. You know, let me just see if I've got a better one that's a little bit more impressive. So the idea with the template mechanism is it's fairly similar. So I can hard code templates in. So I've got, for instance, a line chart with interval band. So that's, I don't have anything I can show you that one, but it's basically a line chart with min and max. So you can have error bands, which is quite cool. Colored scatter plot. So I can add what I think are good examples, and I'm happy to build this out. If somebody's got one that they think is absolutely must have, this can be packaged into the visual and released in the next release. Yeah, so I've got some Vega ones to get you started. Same templates. They don't have to be the same. But this was the idea of the templating mechanism, was if we could find a way as a community to template this, it could be available from a central location rather than packaged into the visual, because that's the problem with these templates, is I have to build them in. So I'm happy to add them. If someone's got one they think is absolutely essential, please let me know and I'll add it in to the next build. But ideally what we'd like to try and do is to make this a little more usable. I don't have anything yet, but again, if somebody wants to work with me, I'd love to help them. So one of the things we've done is, not that it's particularly exciting, is the template schema is available at the website for people, for third-party tools to connect to. If they want to have a front-end tool that can create templates and validate them so that they will work in here, then that will work as well. So it's, again, at the minute, I don't have much of a roadmap other than my own ideas. So if you have, if you have things you want to, if you want to see, you can go to GitHub. And the other thing is it's open source as well. So I'm not interested in, I'm here selling it to you, but I'm not selling it for money reasons. I'm just selling it because I want people to have other ways of doing things. So the visual is open source. You're welcome to create issues and, create features and raise bugs, and I'll just prioritize them and work on them. The caveat being it may not always be possible, but I'll always have a reason why it isn't. And I can't work on this 24/7, but I'm trying to get it as good as people want it. So if I don't know people need things, I can't add it.
Well, this is pre-release, and already it's amazing. What I'll do, Daniel, because the last few questions are all on similar topics, is I'll bundle them together if that's okay.
Yeah, so, absolutely, fire away.
What we'd like to know is it possible to use a custom font? And so, for example, with the bar charts that you showed us there, can we change the shape? So from a rectangle, could we have a different shape or potentially round the edges? And
oh, yeah, totally.
Finally, to bind into that as well is animation.
No.
Okay, those are the 3 points.
So fonts, yes, because it's free format. As long as the font exists on your system, just type in the name of the font as a browser would recognize it, and it will work. Pro tip, if you use Charticulator, you can do that as well. So Charticulator has a drop down, but you can free enter fonts in there as well. So, but you can, yes, you can, pretty much anything you can do in CSS, you can do in Vega Lite or Vega. So if a font exists on your system and you use the systems, you can absolutely put it in any text attribute you want, axes, marks, whatever. Next one was
different shapes.
It's too early here. Yeah. So rounded corners are supported. They're part of the rectangle. You can specify them all the way around or on certain corners. It could just be one corner or all four or two or opposite corners. You can totally do that. Animation, unfortunately, isn't supported yet, but they are doing I'm trying to think what the tool is called. I think it might be called Gemini. The Washington, the IDL, they're working on a tool called Gemini, which allows you to animate between two Vega specifications, but it's very, very early days, so I'm not looking to integrate that just yet. But no, animation is unfortunately not something that it does right now. And what I have to think about is I'm just trying to provide an interface between Power BI and the tooling. But that's certainly a shortcoming of the tooling right now. They know about it though, so they are looking at it. But I don't have any ETAs. I don't speak on behalf of the team. I have no idea. But no, sadly, animation is not. If you want to do animation, you'll need to go right down to the custom visual SDK, which is totally possible. And I do small plug here. I do a course with Radicad on building custom visuals. So if you join, so if you know Reza, his academy, I have a course there on building custom visuals, and we do tackle simple animation as part of that course. But it is a paid for course.
Fantastic.
I think it's the only thing I've charged for.
No problem at all. I don't blame you, and we will pass that out to our participants and user group as well. So, I mean, on that note, Daniel, thank you very much for joining us, because what an absolutely amazing session. And thank you for taking the time to answer the questions as well. It looks like what you're achieving with Deneb is is absolutely amazing and blowing the boundaries, as all of your custom visuals have done. To be quite honest with you, so
Thank you very much.
We applaud, and like I say, it's fantastic and monumental work just to be doing this for the love of it, for the Power BI community.
I'm very fortunate that I can, and it's just I appreciate the challenges people have with learning this stuff. So if we could make it easier, it's not 100% easy, but yeah, no, I'm really, thank you for having me. I've been wanting to meet you for a while as well, so hopefully we can do that physically in person one day. But yeah, it's been lovely being here. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, definitely, and we will definitely have you back with us again in the future.
Oh yeah, and if there's anything, anything you think I could definitely help with, just let me know. I'd love to come back.
Oh, we will do indeed. And for everybody that's joined us, absolutely fantastic session, and thank you for being with us. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with the Microsoft Power BI UK user group, and this event was brought to you in association with Onyx Data. Look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe.